In this video, I'm just going to run through a bunch of my, little tips and secrets I have to catching tailor off the beach. I'm answering all the questions on a post that I put up a few weeks ago about, what you would want to know about myself catching tailor. A lot of the questions are more related to tides and conditions, so I'll cover that a lot in detail in this video. A lot of my other videos cover off the gear that I use, but towards the end of the video, I'll go through the different lures that I'm using at the moment, as well as the types of rods and reels that I've got at the moment, which I'm using to target tailor, particularly off the beach as well. So a lot of the questions that I've been getting are really related to the conditions and how I choose the conditions and where I would fish on different conditions. So I'm going to get stuck into that now. So I'm just going off Willy Weather, which is one of the common sort of apps. They're all pretty similar, but that's the one that I use probably most regularly. The first thing I usually click on is I'll find a spot. It doesn't necessarily matter exactly where the spot is, just a general area. A lot of it's going to be fairly the same, suburb to suburb. You just want to click on somewhere around the map where it's going to give you the readings, which include not just wind direction but also swell and tides. So sometimes you'll put in a suburb and it doesn't have a beacon set for the areas where it will give you the tides and that, so you just click to the closest area. So I usually check the winds first because that sort of dictates potentially the spot that I'm going to choose. So for example, here over the next couple of days, you can see that in the mornings, and again I'm in Perth, Western Australia, so if you're over on the east coast, you're probably just going to swap the directions of east to west in regards to, which direction I'm going to be casting when I'm casting into the wind. So when there's an easterly wind in WA, it means that the wind's at your back when you're facing the ocean, and you can use that to help, get your lures a little bit further. I'm also going to be discussing all this content in relation to using lures. For example, if you're throwing out a heavy sinker with a big bait, fishing a southerly wind like this is not necessarily as much as a problem. Some people really prefer to fish a southerly wind as well. I actually don't mind fishing the southerly in certain areas and certain conditions. When it does get up to this really strong level, it can cause a bit of a bow in your line. So for example, if you're casting out the beach and you're casting in this direction, so you're casting towards the east, what if the wind is going up in upwards direction, it will cause a bow in your line, which doesn't really matter if you're reeling in the lures really, really quickly, but when you go to strike, often you're just going to be pulling the line, the bow on the line, so sometimes you'll lose fish because you don't get that strike to get the hook set. If you're wheeling in the lure as fast as you can, you're often just going to hook them anyway. Having said that, sometimes instead of casting directly east or directly across the wind, you can sort of cast at a diagonal, so that you sort of reduce the bow on your wind, so you won't be able to cast out as far, and you're more casting along the side of the beach. But sometimes that's a really good way to reduce the bow on your wind. The other option is also if you've a southerly wind matches up with a low tide, it means that you can walk out onto a reef and you can cast alongside the beach. So I've caught some really nice fish like that. I will try and snip in a little bit of that into the footage here. Having said that, most of the time I'm fishing early in the mornings just because that's when I'm able to get out with family commitments. So I'm usually sun dependent, out from as early as usually around 4 a.m. As you move into the winter, obviously that sun up comes later and later, so you can have a bit more of a sleep in. In the summer, generally what you'll find is that if you look at the tides, most of the times the mornings link up with a low tide. So with that is just considering the type of area that you're going to approach if you're going to be fishing a lot of low tides. So for myself, if I'm fishing, say, for an early morning, you're looking at the height of the tide, depending on the moon phase. So for example, if you look here, the low is about 0.6, and slowly going up a little bit. But whereas when it was a different moon phase earlier in the month, you can see all the bottom of the tides are around sort of 0.3. So that 30 centimeters of water makes a big difference. So, for example, I was out fishing in this sort of conditions a few weeks ago, and I was walking over the top of reef that I would usually be casting over the top of. So in those instances when you have to fish those really low tides, I often will walk out onto the reef and cast out smaller lures. Often if I'm walking out on the reef, there's going to be low swell rather than getting smashed around. So in conditions where you've got your 0.3, 0.4 to 0.5, I'm usually finding areas of reef which I can walk across with my reef shoes, casting out little lures or little stick baits, and having my fun that way. So if you go back to now, there's still these low little points at a 0.6, so you'll still be able to find some reef that you're going to be able to walk across, but it's really going to be dependent on the swell. So if we look at the swell, you can see it's quite high for walking across reef. So I wouldn't be walking on any sort of reef where, in 2.5 meters swell, it's just too dangerous. And also it's just, even so, it's just not fun at all, regardless, even if it's a little bit of swell. You'd be surprised how little the swell has to be to knock you off the top of some reef, and it's just not worth it. Whereas if we look at, say, next week, slight swell, you probably get away with it. So again, in relation to wind, so over the next few days, you're looking across here on a Friday and Saturday, you've got strong easterlies throughout the day, so meaning that you're not casting into the wind at all on those days. So some of those night sessions on Friday and Saturday would be quite good, particularly as the swell's quite high as well. So I actually don't mind there being a little bit of swell. I think this 1.5 is probably a little bit better on Saturday than it would be when it's getting up to 2.5, it gets a little bit much. It's a little bit harder to use sort of those stick baits that walk across the top, but if you're using metals or something like a CID sprat, it doesn't really matter as much, where you can sort of cut it through the middle of the waves. Sometimes with the swell though, if there's lots of seaweed, it becomes really difficult to fish as well. And that's where using single hooks or using lures which you don't mind losing, so your cheaper metals might be more of the way to go. So when we're talking Tailor, like I'd say probably the best time to fish would probably be the turn. So that first hour and a half after the tide is good, and then the second hour and a half towards the top of the tide. That's for me, personal preference. The change of the tide can be good as well, particularly actually in the Swan River. The change of the tide is really good for some of those bigger Tailor, where they sort of can cruise around and smash some of that bait that comes to the surface, or it's not getting, rushed past in those areas with structure around bridges and whatnot. That's the same with the mulloway too. The turn of the tides is the sort of key areas where you catch those big mulloway. And again, this is just, if you're looking at percentages, you still can catch mulloway or big Tailor at any time in the Swan River, but if we're talking the key chances, I reckon the turn of the top of the tide for big Tailor in the Swan is the way to go. For myself though, I really try not to be put off by where where the height of the tide is. If I'm fishing where it's low, I'll know that I'll have to go to certain reefy areas where I'm either casting over the top, like walking on the top of reef, or casting alongside it where there might be a gutter along the side of the reef. Whereas sometimes if it's on the high tide, I can literally cast over the top of the reef, and you're basically getting those fish hanging out the back and ripping them over the top. If I'm going to be casting on those sort of things where I'm going over the top of the reef, that's where I'll be using sort of those lures on the top of the water column and single hooks so that I don't hook onto the reef. Again with swell, I like a little bit of whitewash, but it doesn't have to be, I guess, like huge waves or whatnot. Particularly in Western Australia and Perth, the waves sort of dump pretty close to the end, and the whitewash isn't the greatest. So sometimes just a little bit of whitewash that's breaking between areas of reef can be good. But yeah, no, anything over about 1 metre swell usually get a little bit of commotion. A southerly wind, like a little bit of a southerly wind, can be helpful to make a little bit of chop as well. But in those glassed out conditions, you can still catch Tailor. But that's where I'm using like little poppers. Like the other day when I used I think it was one of those Bass Day poppers, had a good little fun session there. Or really, small little metals and micro jigs. Something where you're sort of going to catch the attention of those smaller schooling fish rather than those big, Tailor that are thumping whiting and other sort of mullet that's getting smashed up around in the surf. When we're talking about locating different spots or canvassing for areas, I'm just going to go. I've never actually fished these areas. I've just sort of had a bit of a check up on Google Maps, and I just sort of run through what I would be doing if I was exploring an area. So what I'm trying to find for is isolated areas of reef. So, for example, if you fish around, the sort of like Joondalup, Burns Beach sort of area, it's much more of a canvassing sort of area because there's reef after reef after reef. So it's a good place where you sort of grab a couple of lures, one rod, a couple of reels just in case you stuff one up, and then walk a couple of k's up and down the beach casting, looking out for bait. So you're looking out for little flashes, or you're looking out for fish getting chased or getting hit on the top of the water, and you're casting at it. Or you're just looking at little different bits of reefs as you're walking along where you can see little deeper areas or whatnot, and just canvassing. So I found plenty of fish that way. Often you'll get a lot of bycatch of herring and other things if you're just walking along up and down the beach with a couple of metals as well. If you're finding an area where you really want to target and you want to stay put, then it's finding that isolated reef or those gutters. So I'm just having a look at this sort of area here. I can see that water has been sucked in and out around this area, and there's a little bit of reef here. So that could be a decent sort of spot. It's harder to tell on Google Maps about where the gutters are going to be because they're going to change each time. There are plenty of other sort of videos that are going to be better at showing you how to spot a gutter, and often you will need to canvass the area, say the day before when the sun's up and you stand on top of the dunes and you can see the gutters. When you're trying to do it at 4 a.m, it's a little bit more harder to see. But one of the things that you can often see will be where the water's been sucked back into the ocean. So these sort of like mini little troughs can be fun little areas to fish as well. So an area like this, you might walk along to each of these little troughs and cast into it where the water's getting sucked back through. Having said that, if I was walking along this beach here, I'd probably be looking for little chunks of reef. Sometimes you won't be able to see it on Google Maps either, but like little breaks in here. Would be good, and you're looking for like isolated reef where there's lots of clean beach on one area, clean beach on the other, and then you've got reef in the middle. That means that there's likely going to be a concentration of fish in this area hitting the bait along the reef, rather than sort of like I was talking before about those areas around, Joondalup and things like that, which can be absolutely awesome for having great sessions. However, the concentration of those fish, or those fish to be reliably there, are going to be more likely on areas where there's a little bit of isolated reef. Again, this is my opinion, and this is definitely not a hard and fast rule, because there's lots of times that I've gone down to those same sort of areas and had some of my best sessions as well. I've just put a little flag next to this area. So if I was scouting, I'd be looking at something along here. You've got a bend so if fish are going to go from this here to here, they're likely to follow around this bend. Plus you've got little bits of chunks of reef as well. So this sort of area here, it looks like there's a few little deeper holes as well. So the darker water would be a fun sort of place to fish as well, depending on the right tide. Sometimes you look at these things on Google Maps and it looks like a great idea, But it's just, how high is that cliff? Can you get down here safely? If there's a high tide, is it fishable? These are all little questions that you've got to ask, and sometimes you're not going to really know until you get there. But that looks like a fun sort of area that I would target fish or target Tailor for. So a lot of the other questions were related to the type of gear that I use, so rod, reel, lines, lures, and whatnot. So I'll just run through. I've got in my box at the moment, so CID shiver sticks, CID sprats, so some of the smaller 21 grams I'll use for the summer, 30 grams for the winter, shore catch night, kudu long cast, and my zip baits, which you've seen in a lot of my videos. I've been using these buckaboos as well, the 21 to 28 grams, even the 15 grams on the lighter setups during the summer. I've got that CID slim bait, which is a classic, particularly if it's not a weedy area as well. With leaders, I generally go 20 pound, so I'll go 10 pound on my lighter outfit during the summer. During winter, it's 20 or 30 pound usually every time. So I'll generally have one rod with 20 pound braid and 20 to 30 pound leader. FG knot is the way to go, and then I'll use a uni knot when it breaks off. Then I've got another 3000 reel that I'll use on the smaller outfit with 10 pound braid and 10 pound leader in the summer, 20 pound in the winter. For my rods, I have sort of like a 9 or 10 foot rod, 6 to 8 kilos for those heavier stick baits, sort of 30 grams up, and then a 8 foot rod, 3 to 5 kilos for those stick baits from sort of like 15 to 30 grams. So just to finish off, one of the last questions I got is whether I use burley or scent. So for scent, I will when I'm using soft plastics in the river targeting Tailor or other fish, but generally not really when I'm in the ocean. For burley, I'll use burley if I'm going to target herring and skippy and Tailor all at the same time. So sometimes I'll throw out some burley if I'm going to use some micro jigs around some reef. But I'm just targeting Tailor, not generally. That doesn't mean it doesn't work, it's just what I do. I've got a pretty extensive library of Tailor videos if you're new to the channel, so have a look if you're keen to get a few more tips, or feel free to ask any more questions in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.